Get this trash out of my plaza before the donors arrive, and throw whatever diseased scrap he's eating into the gutter. If I see his face on this property again, I want him arrested for trespassing and public endangerment." The words cut through the crisp October air like a serrated blade. They are spoken by Deputy Mayor Richard Vance, a man whose bespoke Italian wool suits and gleaming Patek Philippe watch stand in stark contrast to the scene before him. He stands surrounded by a phalanx of private security guards, 2 city police officers, and a gaggle of terrified silent junior aides holding clipboards. On the cold, polished granite bench in front of them sits Marcus. He is a black man, in his late 50s. He wears a faded, oversized yellow rain jacket that has lost its waterproofing, a pair of cracked leather boots held together by duct tape, and a gray beanie pulled low over his ears. His hands are heavily calloused, dusted with soot and dry earth. Beside Marcus sits a terrified, tear-streaked 6-year-old white boy, wearing a pristine navy blue private school blazer. The boy is holding half of a foil-wrapped sweet potato, Marcus's only meal for the day. Marcus does not flinch at the deputy mayor's screaming. He does not scramble to his feet. He does not apologize, nor does he show a single flicker of intimidation. His heart rate remains perfectly steady. He calmly takes a slow sip from a dented steel thermos, wipes his mouth with the back of his cracked hand, and looks at Vance with a stillness that is entirely unnatural for a man cornered by authority. It is the cold, calculated gaze of a man measuring the structural integrity of a crumbling wall. In exactly 72 hours, Deputy Mayor Vance will be stripped of his title, his pension, and his freedom. He will face federal indictments, the plaza he claims to own will be renamed, and the man sitting in the worn rain jacket will be handed the deed to the most coveted historical estate in the city. But before we get to the financial ruin and the devastating public collapse of a corrupt political empire, to understand how a shared meal on a park bench dismantled a city's hierarchy, you need to go back to the world before the confrontation. The Sterling Vance Plaza was designed to be the crown jewel of the city's downtown financial district. It was a sprawling, 3-acre expanse of imported white Carrara marble, cascading water features, and geometrically perfect rows of Japanese maple trees. It was flanked on all 4 sides by towering monoliths of mirrored glass and brushed steel, the headquarters of investment banks, corporate law firms, and high-end luxury retailers. It was a space meticulously coded for exclusivity. It was a cathedral built for the wealthy, a place where the simple act of walking slowly without a tailored suit was enough to draw the immediate suspicious gaze of private security. To the thousands of executives who hurried across its surface every morning, the plaza was just a beautiful shortcut between their chauffeured cars and their corner offices. But to Marcus Hayes, the plaza was a living, breathing organism. He knew its pulse. He knew its secrets. Every morning, at precisely 5:15 a.m., long before the city's elite awoke in their penthouse suites, Marcus performed his daily ritual. The air in the plaza at that hour always carried a distinct, contrasting scent. The sharp, acrid ammonia of the overnight street sweeper chemicals mingling with the faint, sweet aroma of jasmine planted in the elevated concrete planters. Marcus would emerge from the shadows of the lower transit tunnels. He would sit on the same granite bench near the central fountain. He would unscrew the cap of his heavily dented thermos, pour a cup of instant coffee made with hot water from a gas station sink, and open a thick, waterproof moleskin notebook. For 2 hours, while the sky shifted from bruised purple to a blinding golden morning light that struck the glass towers, Marcus would write. He didn't write poetry, and he didn't write in a diary. He drew complex, highly detailed structural schematics. He calculated load-bearing stress equations. He noted the microscopic hairline fractures forming in the marble joints near the fountain's base. He meticulously documented the subtle, millimeter-by-millimeter subsidence of the eastern retaining wall. He was a ghost, haunting a machine he understood better than anyone alive. Marcus's mother, a woman who had spent 40 years scrubbing the floors of the very corporate buildings that now surrounded him, had instilled a quiet, unbreakable iron in his spine. Long before she passed away, when Marcus was just a young engineering student taking the bus to night classes, she had told him the words that would become the magnetic north of his moral compass. A man's worth isn't in the roof over his head or the cloth on his back, Marcus. It's in the foundation he pours for others, even when they never know his name. Marcus had taken that wisdom to heart. He never begged. He never shouted. He moved through the city with a quiet, invisible dignity that acted as his armor. Even when the cold wind off the harbor cut through his thin jacket, or when the hunger gnawed at his ribs like a rusted blade, he maintained a strict internal code. He kept his posture straight. He kept his clothes as clean as the public sinks would allow. He was a man who had lost everything, his home, his savings, his status, to a catastrophic combination of medical debt from his late wife's illness and a vicious, coordinated corporate buyout that had legally stripped him of his assets. But they had not stripped him of his mind, and they had not stripped him of his secret. The executives walking past him, deliberately averting their eyes from the vagrant on the bench, saw only a man who had failed at life. They saw worn second-hand shoes. They saw the cracked hands of a laborer. They saw a black man existing in a space of overwhelming white affluence, and their brains immediately categorized him as a blight, a security risk, a problem to be scrubbed away. What they did not know, what none of them could possibly fathom as they hurried past with their $5 lattes and leather briefcases, was that Marcus Hayes was not just a homeless man. He was the original architect and structural master planner of the entire downtown revitalization project. 15 years ago, Marcus was the prodigy of the city's urban development sector. He had designed the subterranean flood mitigation barriers that kept the financial district dry during hurricane season. He had mathematically solved the load-bearing impossible geometry that allowed the glass towers to sway safely in high winds. He possessed a mind of staggering, once-in-a-generation brilliance. And, crucially, because of a uniquely structured severance contract signed a decade prior when he was forced out by the newly appointed Deputy Mayor Vance, Marcus still quietly held the intellectual property rights to the structural zoning grid beneath the plaza. He was, technically and legally, the singular licensed expert whose signature was required for any future expansion on the site. But Marcus kept this buried. He watched the world. He documented. He survived. The inciting incident occurred on a Tuesday afternoon. The plaza was bustling with the lunchtime rush. The golden autumn sunlight reflected off the sheer glass walls, casting sharp, brilliant geometric shadows across the white marble. At 1:14 p.m., Marcus was sitting on his bench. He was in the middle of eating his only meal for the day, a large sweet potato he had roasted over a barrel fire the night before, wrapped in aluminum foil to keep it warm, accompanied by a thick slice of stale sourdough bread. That was when he saw the boy. The child, no older than 6, was wandering near the edge of the cascading fountain. He wore a sharply tailored, navy blue blazer with a crest on the breast pocket, the uniform of the elite Wellington Day School. His tie was askew, his eyes were wide with rising panic, and his chest was heaving with silent, terrified sobs. He had clearly been separated from his nanny or his parents in the crushing throng of pedestrians. People in business suits walked right past the crying child. A group of young tech executives, deep in a conversation about venture capital, sidestepped the boy without breaking their stride. A woman in a designer trench coat glanced at the kid, checked her smartwatch, and hurried down the subway stairs. The complicity of the crowd was a heavy, suffocating blanket. No one wanted to get involved. No one wanted to break their momentum. Marcus closed his notebook. He slowly stood up, his worn boots making a soft, scuffing sound against the marble. He moved deliberately, keeping his hands visible and his body language entirely non-threatening. He knew exactly how he was perceived. He knew the danger of a black man in tattered clothes approaching a wealthy white child. He knelt 5 feet away from the boy. He didn't reach out. He didn't speak loudly. "The water gets loud right here," Marcus said, his voice a deep, calming rumble, smooth as worn riverstone. "It confuses the ears, makes it hard to hear your people calling for you." The boy sniffled, wiping his nose on his expensive sleeve, and looked at Marcus. He saw the soot on Marcus's face, but he also saw the absolute, grounding calm in his eyes. "I lost my dad," the boy whispered, his voice trembling. "We were looking at the buildings, and then he was gone." "He's not gone," Marcus said gently, "just misplaced. Big buildings have a way of swallowing people up if you don't know how they're built. Are you hungry?" The boy hesitated, then nodded slowly. Marcus moved back to the bench. He patted the cold stone beside him. The boy followed, hesitant at first, then sat down. Marcus took his foil-wrapped sweet potato, broke it perfectly in half, and offered the larger portion to the child. He handed him the piece of sourdough bread. "Eat," Marcus said. "We'll wait right here. It's the mathematical center of the plaza. Highest visibility. He'll find you." For 10 minutes, the two sat in silence. The homeless architect and the lost child, sharing a meager meal in the shadow of a billion-dollar skyline. The boy ate hungrily, the warmth of the food soothing his panic. Marcus simply sipped his water, watching the structural lines of the buildings, his mind cataloging the exact minute the shadow of the eastern tower touched the edge of the fountain. Then, the chaos arrived. It began with the sharp, aggressive clicking of hard-soled shoes on marble, accompanied by the crackle of a police radio. "There! On the bench! Surround him! Do not let him move!" Marcus did not turn his head immediately. He felt the vibration of heavy footsteps through the granite. He heard the chaotic overlapping of voices. Deputy Mayor Richard Vance burst through the crowd. Vance was a man whose entire political career was built on the optics of aggressive sanitization. He viewed the city not as a community, but as a corporate ledger, and he viewed people like Marcus as red ink. Vance was flanked by 3 private plaza security guards in black tactical gear and 2 city police officers. Trailing behind them was a group of wealthy political donors whom Vance had been giving a walking tour of the district. Vance's face was flushed with a mixture of synthetic outrage and performative authority. He saw the ragged black man sitting next to a Wellington school student, and his mind instantly leaped to the most malicious conclusion possible. "Get away from him!" Vance bellowed, his voice echoing off the glass towers. The boy jumped, startled, dropping his piece of the sweet potato onto the marble. "Get this trash out of my plaza before the donors arrive and throw whatever diseased scrap he's eating into the gutter," Vance spat, gesturing violently toward Marcus. "If I see his face on this property again, I want him arrested for trespassing and public endangerment." The plaza, usually a river of constant motion, suddenly froze. The lunchtime crowd stopped. The bystander effect took immediate toxic root. Dozens of people formed a loose circle. Smartphones were instantly drawn from pockets, their camera lenses zooming in. A young man in a fleece vest began recording. A barista from the corner cafe leaned against the glass, watching with morbid curiosity. A woman covered her mouth, whispering to her colleague. None of them stepped forward. They were eager to consume the spectacle, entirely complicit in their silence. Marcus did not react emotionally. He did not raise his hands in a panic. He did not shout defensively. Never beg, never shout. Dignity is armor. He slowly turned his head to look at Vance. He noted the vein throbbing on the side of Vance's neck. He smelled the faint, expensive scent of bourbon on the deputy mayor's breath, mingling with his heavy designer cologne. "He's lost," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying effortlessly over the ambient noise. "We are waiting for his father." "You don't speak to me," Vance hissed, stepping closer, his expensive shoes crushing the dropped piece of sweet potato into the pristine white marble. "I know exactly what you're doing. You people come down here, you target the vulnerable, you look for a handout or a hostage. You are a parasite on this city's infrastructure. Grab him." 2 security guards lunged forward, grabbing Marcus by the shoulders of his rain jacket. They yanked him roughly off the bench. Marcus's internal composure was absolute. He allowed his body to go limp, offering no physical resistance that could be legally construed as assault, but forcing the guards to bear his dead weight. His eyes flicked to his left. Among the police officers standing behind Vance, there was a single ally. Sergeant David Miller, a 20-year veteran of the force, had his hand resting near his radio. Miller's eyes were narrowed. He looked at the boy, who was now crying again, reaching out toward Marcus. He looked at Marcus's calm, steady demeanor. Miller had walked this beat for years. He knew predators, and he knew peace. The man in the yellow jacket radiated peace. "Hold on, Mr. Vance," Sergeant Miller said, his voice a low, gravelly warning. "The kid is unharmed. Let's step back and assess before we put hands on anybody." "Shut up, Miller!" Vance snapped, turning his back to the officer. He looked at the crowd, playing directly to the smartphone cameras. "This is what happens when we show leniency. We get vagrants infecting our high-value economic zones. I want him detained. I want him processed. I want him gone." Marcus stood up straight, shaking off the guard's hands with a single sharp twitch of his shoulders. The guards, unnerved by his sudden, commanding physical presence, stepped back half a pace. Marcus reached into his pocket. The guards tensed, one reaching for his baton. Marcus slowly pulled out his battered smartphone. The screen was cracked, but the camera worked perfectly. In one smooth motion, he took a photograph of Vance standing over the crushed sweet potato, capturing the aggressive posture, the private security guards, and the exact time on the digital clock of the bank building behind them, 1:22 p.m. Then, he tapped his screen 3 times, sending a pre-written text message and a digital Dropbox link to a contact saved only as legal JD. "You're making a permanent record of a temporary emotion, Richard," Marcus said. His voice was no longer the soft rumble he had used with the boy. It was the sharp, precise tone of an executive in a boardroom. Vance blinked, genuinely caught off guard by the use of his first name. "What did you say to me, you piece of garbage?" "I said," Marcus replied, his eyes locked onto Vance's, "you are acting on surface assumptions, and in structural engineering, Assuming a surface is solid without checking the foundation is how you collapse a building. The crowd murmured. The tension in the air was palpable, thick as humidity before a thunderstorm. "Dad!" The scream tore through the plaza, high-pitched and desperate. The crowd parted violently. A man in a tailored charcoal suit, his face pale with raw panic, broke through the circle of onlookers. He sprinted toward the bench, dropping a leather briefcase that clattered loudly against the marble. It was Thomas Sterling, the mayor of the city, the billionaire developer whose family name was literally carved into the stone beneath their feet. The little boy launched himself off the bench, running past the security guards and slamming into the mayor's legs. Mayor Sterling fell to his knees, burying his face in his son's neck, his chest heaving. "Leo! Oh my God, Leo! I turned around for 5 seconds." The plaza went entirely, breathlessly silent. The only sound was the cascading water of the fountain and the soft, ragged breathing of the mayor hugging his son. Deputy Mayor Vance's posture instantly transformed. The aggressive chest-out swagger vanished, replaced by a sycophantic, oily deference. He stepped forward, smoothing his tie. "Tom," Vance said, his voice dripping with false relief. "Thank God, we just found him. This vagrant had cornered him. I was just having security remove the threat. I handled it, Tom. We kept him safe." Mayor Sterling kept his arms wrapped around his son. He looked up, his eyes scanning the security guards, the police officers, and finally settling on the man in the faded yellow rain jacket. The boy pulled back from his father's shoulder. He pointed a small, trembling finger at Vance. "That man yelled," the boy said, his voice echoing in the quiet plaza. Then he pointed at Marcus. "That man gave me his food. He told me to stay in the middle so you could find me." Mayor Sterling's eyes locked onto Marcus. For 3 agonizingly long seconds, the mayor simply stared at the cracked boots, the soot-stained hands, and the calm, unblinking eyes beneath the gray beanie. Then, the color drained entirely from the mayor's face. It wasn't a look of gratitude. It was a look of profound, earth-shattering realization. It was the look of a man seeing a ghost. Mayor Sterling stood up slowly. He didn't look at Vance. He kept his eyes entirely on Marcus. "Good God," the mayor whispered. The microphone of the smartphone cameras caught the sound perfectly. "Tom, really, it's under control," Vance insisted, stepping between the mayor and Marcus. "We're taking him to the precinct." "Shut your mouth, Richard," the mayor said. The words were quiet, but they carried a lethal, absolute authority. Vance froze. The donors behind him exchanged nervous, confused glances. Mayor Sterling gently pushed past his deputy mayor. He walked up to Marcus. To the absolute shock of the hundreds of people watching, the billionaire mayor of the city extended his hand. Marcus looked at the hand. He did not take it. He simply kept his hands folded over his waterproof notebook. "Marcus," the mayor said, his voice thick with a mixture of awe and deep shame. I thought you left the city 10 years ago. I thought you moved out west after the buyout." "I never left the foundation, Thomas," Marcus replied evenly. Vance let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. "Tom, what are you doing? You know this guy?" The mayor finally turned to look at his deputy. The fury in Sterling's eyes was absolute. It was the look of a man who realized his entire administration was standing on a landmine that had just been triggered. "Do I know him?" the mayor repeated, his voice rising in volume, projecting out to the crowd, the cameras, and the donors. "Richard, are you out of your mind? Do you have any idea who you just put your hands on?" Vance swallowed hard. "He's a trespasser, a vagrant." "This is Marcus Hayes," the mayor announced, his voice booming across the marble. "He is the former chief engineer of public works. He designed this plaza. He engineered the subterranean flood walls that keep your house from sinking into the harbor. He holds the patents to the very structural grid we are standing on." The mayor paused, pointing a finger directly at Vance's chest. "And because of the severance clause you engineered when you forced him out 10 years ago, he technically still owns the developmental rights to the entire eastern quadrant of this district." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic and the sharp intake of breath from the woman in the trench coat who had ignored the boy earlier. The young man with the fleece vest lowered his phone slightly, his mouth hanging open. The bystanders who had been laughing moments before suddenly looked physically ill. The complicity they had comfortably worn a minute ago suddenly felt like a criminal indictment. Deputy Mayor Vance physically deteriorated. It happened in real time, captured by a dozen lenses. The color vanished from his cheeks, his shoulders slumped. The expensive tailoring of his suit suddenly seemed hollow, as if the man inside had evaporated. His knees gave a slight, involuntary buckle. That's impossible, Vance stammered, looking at the tattered rain jacket. Look at him. He's homeless. Marcus finally moved. He took one step forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not show anger. He spoke with the devastating, clinical precision of a scalpel cutting through diseased tissue. You walked into my plaza, Marcus began, his voice resonant and commanding. You stood on marble that I stress-tested. You leaned against glass that I angled to catch the autumn sun. You built your political career, boasting about the economic resilience of a district that I designed, engineered, and kept from sinking into the mud. Vance tried to back away, but the security guards, realizing the shifting power dynamic, had subtly moved aside, leaving him exposed. And when you saw a black man sitting quietly in a space you falsely believe belongs only to your tax bracket, Marcus continued, stepping closer, his eyes locking Vance in a paralyzing grip, the very first thing you did was attempt to criminalize his existence. You didn't ask a question. You didn't look at the context. You called me a parasite. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out the waterproof moleskin notebook. He tapped the black cover. I didn't beg for my humanity today, Richard. You publicly surrendered yours. Marcus looked over at the mayor. I sent the Dropbox link to Jonathan Davies at the federal prosecutor's office 3 minutes ago. It contains 7 years of my structural audits of this district, including the $14.2 million in municipal maintenance funds that Richard diverted to his private donor PACs, which is why the eastern retaining wall is currently failing by 4 millimeters a year. I documented every crack in the stone. I documented every diverted dollar. Vance's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The political donors standing behind him literally took 3 steps backward, physically distancing themselves from the blast radius of his ruined life. Sergeant Miller, Marcus said, looking at the seasoned officer who had tried to intervene. Miller stepped forward immediately, his posture rigid with respect. Yes, sir. I believe the deputy mayor is currently trespassing on private developmental property without the licensed owner's consent, Marcus said calmly. And I believe he just confessed, on camera, to attempting to unlawfully detain a private citizen. Sergeant Miller didn't hesitate. He unclipped his handcuffs. The metallic snick-snick sound echoed sharply across the marble. Mr. Vance, Miller said, grabbing the deputy mayor's arm in a firm, unbreakable grip. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. As Vance was handcuffed, stammering incoherently about misunderstandings and calling his lawyers, the crowd remained dead silent. The smartphone cameras continued to roll, documenting the complete spectacular collapse of a man who had mistaken a worn coat for weakness. Marcus looked down at the boy, who was holding his father's hand tightly. Marcus offered a small, brief smile. Stay out of the blind spots, Leo, Marcus said softly. Then, without looking back at the arrested deputy mayor or the stunned crowd, Marcus Hayes zipped up his yellow rain jacket, turned, and walked away. He walked with the slow, measured, unbroken stride of a king walking through his own castle. The aftermath was swift, procedural, and entirely devastating for the corrupt architecture of the city's politics. Within exactly 72 hours, the video of the confrontation had been viewed 40 million times across every major platform. The internet had done what it does best. It forensically dissected the incident. They found the legal clauses. They verified Marcus's identity. They amplified the staggering injustice of a genius architect forced onto the streets by corrupt municipal maneuvering. Deputy Mayor Richard Vance was fired by the mayor's office before the sun set that Tuesday. By Friday, following the exact financial trail detailed in Marcus's waterproof notebook, federal agents raided Vance's home and his private PAC offices. He was indicted on 14 counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and civil rights violations. He was denied bail. The private security company that had put hands on Marcus had their municipal contracts permanently revoked. The police officers who had stood by silently were suspended, pending internal review, while Sergeant Miller was promoted to lieutenant and placed in charge of the district's newly reformed community liaison unit. But the true justice, the quantified, undeniable restoration of dignity, came 1 week later. It happened on a quiet Sunday morning. Marcus was sitting on the front porch of a sprawling, beautiful Victorian home in the city's historic garden district. The paint was peeling slightly, and the yard was overgrown with wild jasmine, but the bones of the house were perfect. It was his house, the home he had grown up in, the home his mother had worked her entire life to pay off, the home the city, under Vance's direction, had illegally seized via eminent domain and tax lien manipulation a decade prior. A black town car pulled up to the curb. Mayor Thomas Sterling got out. He wasn't flanked by press or cameras. He walked up the cracked concrete path alone, holding a heavy manila folder. Marcus was drinking coffee from a ceramic mug now, though he still had the waterproof moleskin notebook open on his lap. The city council held an emergency session last night, Mayor Sterling said quietly, stopping at the bottom of the porch stairs. The restitution package was approved unanimously. The deed to this property has been transferred back into your name, free and clear, permanently. Marcus simply nodded, taking a slow sip of his coffee. Furthermore, the mayor continued, opening the folder, the $14.2 million in stolen maintenance funds has been recovered. The council has authorized a $2.5 million retroactive consultancy payout to you for the structural audits you provided, with a formal public apology issued into the congressional record. Put the money into the Affordable Housing Trust, Marcus said, his voice carrying the same calm, resonant tone it had in the plaza. Every cent of it! Earmark it for families facing medical foreclosure, and require my signature on the architectural plans. The mayor looked at the man on the porch. He saw the worn hands, still rough from years on the street, but he also saw the absolute, unshakable power of a man who had outlasted his enemies through sheer integrity. Done, the mayor said softly. He placed the folder on the wooden railing. He hesitated for a moment. My son, Leo. He asked me this morning if the man who built the city was safe now. Marcus looked out at the overgrown jasmine in his yard. He thought of his mother, whose hands used to smell exactly like those flowers after a long day of scrubbing floors. Tell him the foundation is secure, Marcus replied. 6 months later, on a warm spring afternoon, Marcus was kneeling in the dirt of his front garden. He was showing a neighbor's young daughter, a black girl with bright eyes and a curious mind, how to use a compass and a straight edge on a piece of graphing paper. He guided her small hand, drawing a perfect, load-bearing arch. See? Marcus told her softly. If you build the base strong enough, it doesn't matter how hard the wind blows at the top. The structure holds. The cycle of dignity, unbroken and undeniable, continued. We watch stories like this, and we cheer for the twist. We love the moment when the arrogant villain realizes they've just insulted a secret king. We love the shock, the gasp, the delicious delivery of karma. But if you only focus on the secret identity of Marcus Hayes, you are entirely missing the point of what happened on that plaza. The core injustice wasn't that Richard Vance humiliated a brilliant, wealthy architect. The core injustice is that Richard Vance believed it was perfectly acceptable to humiliate a homeless man. He believed that poverty was a crime, that ragged clothes stripped a human being of their right to exist in public space, and that his expensive suit gave him the moral authority to be cruel. What would you have done if you were in that plaza? When the screaming started, when the security guards lunged, when the crowd pulled out their phones to film a man being degraded instead of stepping in to help him, would you have been the one to step forward? Or would you have rationalized your silence? Would you have looked away, assuming authority knows best? If this story made you uncomfortable, if it made you question how you look at the unseen people in your own city, send it to someone who needs to hear it. Share this with the people in your life who mistake a person's surface for their substance. Subscribe to this space as we continue to document the ongoing series of real, unfiltered justice in a world that desperately needs it. Because true human value doesn't need a tailored suit. It doesn't need a billion-dollar bank account. It doesn't need an office in a glass tower. It just needs a foundation of unbreakable dignity. Remember that? It just needs a foundation of unbreakable dignity. What did you think of the pacing in the middle confrontation? Did the sensory details help ground the scene for you?